Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at the Smith & Wesson Airweight 38 Special and just talk about Smith & Wesson revolvers in general a little bit. And this is one of the first firearms I ever picked up, which is why it's torn to hell. And hopefully you can learn from some of the things that I made mistakes on before I knew anything about what I was doing. So, one of those things is about having the right kind of screwdrivers. So if you notice, this screw here, holding the whole thing together, is torn up. And I mean just chowdered to heck and back. And that's because I just grabbed whatever I had as a screwdriver at the time and just ground on it and didn't know what I was doing. So I didn't know that there was such a thing as gunsmithing screwdrivers and all that fancy stuff. But there is, and using them is important. So when you get a set of gunsmithing screwdrivers, what you always want to be doing is looking for the screwdriver bit that fills the slot as best as possible. So as gunsmithing screwdrivers, first of all, are vertically shanked, so they will, these ones are special cut to be just straight up and down. I don't really like this set, to be honest. They're okay, but they didn't come in a whole lot of various sizes. Most are just tapered much more sharply. So a traditional, well, that's not a good example because that's a bent one, but a traditional standard screwdriver is, just a V at the end. And a gunsmithing one will actually be sloped. It'll be a big curve so that the end of it is nearly straight up and down. So this one just gets uniformly wider the further you go back. Gunsmithing ones, the tip, especially that last few millimeters, is going to be as straight as possible. And what that does is it means it's going to fill the entire slot of the screw so that when you take it apart, there's no room for it to wiggle. It's going to put force evenly on the left side, the right side, and not, be halfway into the middle of the screw and causing all other manner of troubles. The other thing you might notice is the frame is very visible around this one. Now, partially because it's A, it's aluminum, B, it's black, but C is not knowing how to get that off. The first few times, I, pried it off like an idiot. And that's the exact wrong way to approach that particular problem. Where the hell are my screwdriver bits? Oh well. So, without further ado, we're just going to dive into this with the closest things we have on hand. And get going here. So, first off, it's not loaded. Always a good thing to do before we blow ourselves up. Take the grips off. With most revolver grips, you have a single screw going all the way through, nice long screw, and there's usually some other support, often just a roll pin at the bottom. Sometimes there's more than one, but the idea is that this little hole in the grip lines up with that, so you actually have 2 points of contact as well as the contour of the frame, and that's why the grips don't slip around and move all over the place. So pull these off and set them aside for now. The next thing you want to do is to remove the 3 side plate screws. And again, this is a terrible example because I actually don't have my good gunsmithing screwdriver here, so since this screw is already hosed, I'll just make it a little bit worse. Actually, I'm looking for my good set. It's very frustrating. Hiding in plain view is a better set. Let's just use the better set. And there we go. So, perfect example of what I was just talking about. With the smaller screwdriver, I was slipping all over the place and monkeying up the head even worse. This one had a touch of the red Loctite. Now, this front screw on the Airweight is not just a screw, it's actually a spring-loaded detent. So that pointy bit is actually a spring and a little stud. I generally don't take them apart because it kind of tears the spring up to do so, and there's no real need to. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now and go back to a smaller tip for these ones. And these two on the back are going to be regular screws that are just much smaller. Now, if you're got a fancy revolver that you really love, one of the things to do is to actually mark out the holes on it, draw the outline of the base of the side plate and on a piece of cardboard and push the screws through the cardboard so you put the exact screw into the exact hole. That's always a good thing to do in general, especially if there's a lot of different sizes of screws involved. But in our case, these two back ones are the exact same size, and God only knows where they came from the factory, because I've had this thing apart more times than, well, I've had it apart a lot. All right, so now here's the most important thing about getting the side plate off of a revolver is don't pry. I mean, lots of times you think, oh, I can get a screwdriver in there, or maybe behind the trigger, or wherever. That's wrong. These are not designed to come off that way. If you pry them up, especially these light aluminum sides, this piece is going to get bent. The whole thing's not going to be right, and it's never going to seat perfectly again. And the result is that you chowder up the edge, and it ends up looking like that, where you have this big gross aluminum shiny line all the way around the side. So before take that off, we can now actually remove the cylinder. So you open it up, and this is the screw that's holding that cylinder in, the one with the spring-loaded detent. Once it's open, if you just hold the cylinder, you can pull the crane out and the cylinder itself. So we will get into those in a bit later. This is also covered in schmoo. Oh my god. This has way too much oil on it. I was experimenting last I was playing with this, I suspect. Jesus, without the cylinder, this thing is just about weightless. That aluminum frame. This is a great gun for personal protection, but it is not a good gun to shoot. It is like getting hit in the hand with a baseball bat, even with just little 38s in there. It's nearly weightless. The only steel is the barrel and the cylinder. The rest of this lightweight aluminum frame is just there's nothing there. So that whole force of the round, really, you feel that. So to get the side plate off, the answer is that you tap it off. So either a plastic or rubber mallet or anything that's not made of metal, and you just tap the other side, and what you'll see is that it will start to come up. Now hopefully mine is not so chowdered out that it's not going to move at all. It's starting to move. So we can see the side plate starting to come up. That's a good sign. With a little luck, the whole thing will come up, and hopefully not too many of the other parts will go flying when it finally comes loose. So that's how you get it off. As you can see, this one has oil in it, which is not something I also recommend. I don't even use oil on revolvers anymore. Revolvers are the best excuse in the world to actually break out the good grease. So forgive all the crappy work you're going to see on this one. So now that that's out of the way, we can see all the moving bits. So this, let's see, when this is also something I'm going to do that I don't want you to do a lot of, because there's a great deal of force that we're going to be placing on this pin. Normally, when the frame is together, all these pins are supported on the left and right. When you have the thing apart and you just operate it, all that strain is only being held by the one side, and it's very easy for the small pins to actually shear off. And once they shear off, you're going to be buying a new gun, essentially. The only way to replace them is to drill a hole through the other side, weld it, and refinish the whole gun, and it always is going to look pretty much like hell. So if we retract the cylinder release, we'll be able to actually operate the gun. And obviously a double action only, since it's quote-unquote hammerless, meaning it has no exposed hammer. So here's our hammer coming back, and there's a couple things to notice. One is that, let's see, when we do this, the hammer goes all the way forward and actually hits the firing pin. This does not have a striker bar or a hammer safety, because the hammer is not, because there's no single action is generally the idea. It doesn't merit it from a design perspective. So when the gun is at rest, when you've taken your finger off the trigger, what you're going to see is that the hammer, it's being moved back by the spring assembly here. So as the trigger comes forward, this little bar is going to move forward, and there's a lump in this bar that catches underneath that hammer. And so as it moves forward during the reset, it's going to bring the hammer back a little bit. So just to there, and then it becomes a stabilizing shelf, preventing the hammer from going anywhere, forward or back. So at this point, the hammer can't move forward. This is the drop safety. So because the trigger spring housing is butted against the bottom of the hammer can't move. In order to go forward or backward, this piece has to be out of the way. So it can't push the firing pin forward. So when you're actually pulling the trigger, one of the first things that happens, oops, I can't remember, pull the cylinder latch out of the way, is it moves those pieces apart. And if it didn't, then you wouldn't be able to actually come up. So the reason there's a little bit of daylight here and that these parts aren't built to just a butt is because this has to have just enough room to start going backwards so that the hammer can lift off of it safely. And then comes back, and it's being cocked by the upper sear, and then it transfers from the top sear to the actual back of the secondary sear, and then that drops off, and boom. So we'll be able to see all that in more detail shortly. Let me find, I need a couple scrap pieces of metal here to use as retaining pins. These should do. You're going to want 2 small pieces of metal. They don't have to be real big. Actually, for this gun, I think I only need 1. So I'll switch to 1. What we want to do is captivate this spring. You might not be able to see it, but there is a hole drilled through the hammer strut down at the bottom. And the point of that is that as you start to cock the hammer, if we hold the hammer back and have it all the way cocked, that hole is exposed, and we can stick something through it, which will completely fail to do what I was trying to do. So let me try that again. There we go. Put the piece of metal through the hole, and there. Now this spring is now captivated, so when we return the hammer forward, this hammer strut didn't go with it, and we can pop it out of the frame. Of course, if you wanted to replace this spring, then you would obviously have to, push down on the little plastic bit, take the metal piece out. I'm retracting it a little just to make it easier to put back in. So if it's all the way through the gun, then it butts up against the far side. So this will be easier to go when we want to put it back in, so that it's not, sticking out the far side of the gun. So anyway, leave this as an assembly for reassembly later. And now the only spring, well, there's, I guess, 4 springs left inside the gun. There's the trigger return spring, there's the spring for the bolt, and then there's the firing pin spring, and then there's the spring that's operating the hand. So we're going to get those guys one at a time, but first we're going to get at least I think I can do that now. I get the hammer out before I take the hand out? I think so. Yes. I think right here at the all the way back position of the trigger, I could lift out the hammer assembly. All right. So that's one. Oh gosh, there's a fifth spring back here, the return force for that. Someday I'll learn to count. All right, now here's one that there's a great tool for, which I don't happen to have. This spring is completely encased in the trigger return housing, and there is a tool that helps you grab onto this because basically you have a little real estate above and below the pin itself into which you can get in there and relieve some of the spring pressure. And so getting it back in is really where this becomes challenging. So hang on to this spring. It'll launch across the room. This is actually a weak spring, and I talked to you about spring packs for these guns because this is actually not a good way to do this. What you see here is a standard strength spring that's had a coil cut off of it. That's the poor man's way to reduce trigger weight. It's also completely unsafe and very unreliable. They make Wolf Springs, JP makes them, a whole bunch of places make competition trigger packs where the spring is the right size and just a lighter weight spring, which is what you actually want. Shortening the spring, if you shorten it by just a little bit too much, you will start to have operating failure issues. It really has to have the right curve of power all the way through to make it return smoothly and operate correctly. So yes, somebody could told you you could lighten your trigger by just clipping off a coil, and they're not lying. It's just not the right way to do it. Spend a full $2 on a spring pack, and you'll never regret it. Oops, I'm just cleaning that off camera. Sorry about that. And I'm cleaning this because I'm hopefully going to reapply a proper layer of grease to this. Now the other thing you'll notice is that a lot of these surfaces are polished, most of which don't need polishing at all. This was back, again, like I said, one of my first guns, and somebody told me on the internet that polishing things made them work better. So not knowing what the hell was going on, I would pretty much polish every surface, not even aware of which ones made contact with other pieces of metal. Son of a bitch, there's a sixth spring in here. I will never get that count right. So while we have this in our hand, I'm going to go ahead and remove said sixth spring. There is a small spring in here operating this part of the sear. Well, while it's together, we'll show you... Where'd the hammer go? No, hammer's in my hand. Where did the... Oh, the trigger's not out yet. I'm going to leave this together for a second because we need the trigger to demonstrate what I was just babbling about. Okay, so the hand. Now you can do this in one of two ways. You can either pull the hand back and remove it from the trigger, at which point, since I can't remember how that trigger spring in there works, I don't think there's something that's going to fly out. I think it's a coiled spring that's captivated. Or you can just pull the hand back and remove the trigger at the same time. You have to hold the hand out of the way and, lift gently. Again, we don't want to put any more stress on the pins than we have to. And then we can see in there the other spring and how it works. So there's this leg, which actually comes out, which is nice. A lot of them on the fuller frame, larger size models, this is not a removable piece. I like to remove it because it just means I can clean it. So it just sits down there, and that's what actually activates on the trigger housing there. So that little roof keeps it from going up, and it's pretty low so it can't go down, and there's a round hole so the ball end of this joint sits in there, and then of course it's rotating as the trigger moves back and forth and making it so this just moves horizontally and allowing this to move in an arc. So that's two pieces. And then there is a coil spring that is, how is that bound? Does the whole, yeah, I think the whole thing comes out once I take this pin out. I'll see if I can get it out. The hand has a long leg and a short leg. The short leg is the one that the spring is caught on, so we can see the short leg moving the spring. and the long one just goes all the way through to give it, a solid base for rotation. So when I pull this out, that short leg is going to pop, of the spring's going to pop off the hand, and then suddenly there's no pressure, and the hand comes right out. And that spring is now, I think, just free floating in there. Let there be flashlight. Yeah, I think he's just floating. Or maybe I'm blind. So it's definitely wedged in there. You can see the other leg of the spring is through this little L-shaped window. You can see the back leg of it. So I guess I would probably have to grab that and pull with pliers. I might just leave that in there. It's not hurting anybody. Let's see if I have... We'll give it one attempt to pull it out with the pliers, and if it gives us too much resistance, then we're just going to leave it because it ain't hurting anybody. And if it's hard to get out, it's going to be hard to get back in. Oh, no, there it goes. All right, there's a view of that spring. And it's just not that exciting. So it's got a long leg and a short leg. The short leg is the one that sits in there in the back of it. And then the long leg, this is where the hand goes in, and so it's long enough to catch the other leg of the hand. So again, while I have it out, wipe off all the schmutz. No idea what I was thinking. You know what? I think I do know what I was thinking. I think that was a new type of oil that I got, and so I pulled off all the grease to experiment with how much I liked that oil, and then I don't think I ever shot the revolver again. Mainly because it's just no fun. Like I said, great for 5 rounds of self-defense. Not so great if you enjoy having hands. So I'm going to see if we can't tuck this guy back in the same way we got him out. Grab him in the busted up pliers and just try and see. I missed. Fail. I hope that when you guys watch these videos that you pay attention to where I have a hard time doing things and then say to yourself, maybe I should just let that one go. Because sometimes that kind of discretion is the better part of valor. Alright, so basically now I'm going to peek in there with the flashlight again. And yes, the short leg is all the way to the back of the area cut out by the little L, which tells me it's in the right spot. Basically, there's a little rounded cutout where the coils of the spring sit. Again, not rocket science. However, now that we have both of these guys out at the same time, we can talk about how revolvers cock themselves. So this leg here is part of the cocking action. It's the beginning of it. So the trigger, when you first pull it, that's the first part that engages, and it begins the rotation of the hammer. However, at a certain point, these guys are aligned just so that that will transfer over to this edge right here, and this very, very tiny sear, whoops, like that. And that becomes the final part that drops off. So the beginning of the hammer take up is on the top part, and then it's going to smoothly, now of course without them being in the gun. We'll put these back in after I clean this up. That'll show it better. The hand, we all know what the hand is doing. It's reaching in here and rotating the cylinders up to the next stop. So that's what the hand is all about, and it's just designed so that when it comes back down, it can just flop over stuff. So let's see, what do I want to take out next? So this little pin here holds in the firing pin and its spring, and it really just sits in there fairly gently, and hopefully I should be able to tap this a little bit and get the firing pin moving. And so there you can see the firing pin is that big recess in it is where this pin goes and holds it from falling out, and the firing pin doesn't really move a whole lot. Can only move as much as this pin lets it. So that's the whole motion. And then in here is presumably, unless I've lost it, the firing pin return spring. There she glows. Ta-da. And this just, keeps it from staying out there and poking at the back of rounds when it doesn't need to. It just draws it back in, and it's very weak. It's not a super strong spring, but it's not a very heavy piece of metal that it has to hold back. So it's enough force that if you dropped it, it's going to match any gravity forces from the plunger to keep this from falling somehow fast enough to actually pop a primer. With this little weight, that's like pretty much impossible anyway. So the real thing you want to do is not have this firing pin just dangling forward where it could get caught between rounds as the cylinder is moving. So not so much a safety mechanism as just a keep it out of the way mechanism, or not a drop safety mechanism anyway. Clean up some more of the shmoo. And now one more screw. This is slightly more substantial than the last one, so I can get the larger screwdriver. Yeah, see, this screwdriver too thick at the end, so if I had actually gone ahead and just shoved it in there and started turning, it would have torn up the head of that screw. Whereas this is a thinner screwdriver, it's going to actually get much deeper in there, and that way I don't damage the screw coming out. Dirty Q-tip. So there's a couple different mechanisms, or different variations, I guess I should say, on how different manufacturers do where's my tiny punch, do this particular piece on the cylinder release latch. In this case, full of oil, this is actually the bolt, not the screw. The screw is a permanently a fixed piece of the actual mechanism, and so sometimes, though, it's the other way around. This will have the hole, and a screw will actually go in. So it doesn't really matter. It's just how they decided to build it. I think these ones work a little bit better because I got nothing to back up that because statement. I just think they work better. So now there's nothing else holding this in except for the dimensions of the frame. And what we want to do is, let's see, it's going to be as far forward as it can go because there's a spring-loaded piece back there. And that's kind kind of the challenge. So there's two ways you can go about removing this. You can try and draw it all the way to the back and see if it's got clearance. Most don't, though. That piece is generally made to come all the way flush when there's nothing pushing on it. But what happened here is the back part started moving up for us, which is close enough. It's what we need. So we're looking for that happy medium where we can not lose this spring in detent, bring it as far back as possible, and out. So this is a tiny detenting spring that goes into this piece and pushes it back forward. This is the actual working bit of this whole piece. So again, covered in oil. It looks like C-3PO after Luke bought him and gave him a bath. Thank the maker. All right. So yeah, this is the opposing force to this. When you snap the cylinder into place, that little wear mark is where the side of the gun pushes it in, and that goes all the way through. So when the side of the gun is pushing it in, it's also pushing that piece back. That is going to push this piece back. But when it's all the way in there and it's perfectly lined up, then it's meeting this force. And this little dinky spring back here ain't nothing compared to the spring that's in here. So when these two meet, this guy wins, and he pushes this piece back. That actually disengages this as a safety, because when this is all the way forward, it blocks the hand, so the trigger can't be pulled. So it has to be pushed back for anything to happen. So when the cylinder's open, you can't pull the trigger. And this also is going to be perfectly centered, because that's where that hole is. So that keeps the revolver on center, and it also disengages the safety. So that's how revolvers do what they do. The last piece is the bolt, which is mildly a pain in the butt to get out, just because there's not a whole lot of real estate to work with for this spring. And this spring tends to be like, if you don't want to just try and pull the spring out, it usually goes a little bit of the way into this piece, so you're left with the challenge of trying to operate it, so to speak. In other words, do something so that it comes down, but at the same time you've got to get it further down than it normally travels. You've got to get it down inside the frame so that it can clear the rest of the gun as it comes out. And it's a tight fit. Basically, it will line up best when it perfectly matches the contours of that pin. Probably can't see that particularly well. I'm trying to lift it up a tad. So what am I going to try and do to get this out? I'm going to try and use this punch to hold it up, and then come in there with my little utility knife and try and lift it up. And that worked pretty well. So yeah, the straighter this moves, the happier everybody is. You're putting the least amount of force on all of the bits if it's moving perfectly straight up out of the gun. And as you can see, this little spring does go into a cubby hole, which is why you can't really get the spring out first without bending it. There is, on this one, not really a whole lot of specific recess for that. I mean, it's a little rounded out there, but not a lot. So there's usually just not a lot of room to work with when you're dealing with this. So now I think that's pretty much all the parts. I'm just wiping out the crazy over application of oil, and I'll also show you some neat tidbits about why most revolvers aren't made of aluminum. One of the tricks for smoothing out the trigger pull is, in fact, polishing the underside of this piece. So this piece moves back and forth on the bottom of the frame, and it doesn't move up and down, and it doesn't move left and right. So it doesn't really engage the left and right sides with any degree of force, but it does ride on that bottom fairly thoroughly. So the smoother that surface is, the smoother everything is. Polishing the left or the right side gets you very little by comparison. All these marks, however, are a result of getting it in and out and having various tools slip and dig into the aluminum. If this were made of steel, none of these marks would be here because these were not hard hits. However, because it's aluminum, every time anything goes wrong, when you're pushing this back in and you're trying to get that spring in at the same time, when it finally pops into place, two things have gone wrong. One is the front corner has been digging in while you tried to lever it into place. And then two is the pin itself is going to have gotten, plenty torn up. And if you've slipped with your screwdriver, and you leave all these other nicks. And then, once all those nicks are there, suddenly the aluminum is not so smooth. So now, even though the left side wouldn't normally have a whole lot of contact with the inside of the frame, because we've raised all those bumps by digging it with the screwdriver, the royal we being me, any benefit I got from smoothing this out has pretty much been offset and overridden by how much damage I did to it. So there you go. Live and learn. It's funny how much you realize you make mistakes once you actually learn how to do something correctly. And I keep these kind of things around as a trophy reminder of how much we don't know. Keeps you from getting cocky. So just trying to remove a lot of this excess oil. Like I said, I'm going to probably substitute in some decent grease instead of oil when I go back in here. So we want to remove as much as we can of all the oil that was sitting there originally. And that way when we get in there with the grease, it doesn't float away. Clean out the firing pin hole, make sure there's no brass chips accumulating in there. It's not nearly as much of a problem on revolvers as it is on semi-automatics because revolvers don't have a big ol' extractor claw ripping chips of brass off every time they auto feed the next round. So really it's more stuff that gets in there while you're cleaning that I'm fighting with these days. If you have some burning desire to, you can take this out, this other pin. It's just it's just a detent, a spring, and this pin. So if you drove that out, then that would all come out. You can see, how it works there. It's not super fancy. It only goes in one way, just like the firing pin. It's the same mechanism, just pointing the other direction. I don't knock it out simply because A, it's not dirty, it's not greasy, it's not messed up, and B, this pin is still more or less looking relatively nice, and why damage it? There's no real benefit to cleaning that bit of it out. So what else did we... we were going to put in some of these pieces to watch how they interact. There. Okay. So here is our gun, and my thumb is acting as the hammer spring to put some tension on this. So as we first begin to pull the trigger, you'll see that the this side isn't touching anything, but these two are engaged. So that starts to work, and based on how they're positioned, you see it very smoothly transfer till the dynamic has become different. So now you've got this surface holding up underneath the hammer here. And actually the sear surface I was looking at on the hammer earlier is wrong. That's the single action sear, and since this doesn't have a single action mode, I'm not sure why presumably they use the same part. So anyway, this is going to actually break simply, when this drifts past the end of the hammer. So as soon as the trigger gets to right there, boom, the hammer's cleared to fall. So why is this spring loaded? Well, if you look at the path of the trigger as you're coming back, it would bottom out against it if it wasn't. So the trigger has to be able to push that out of the way to get reset. So if you don't let the trigger come all the way forward, you're not actually going to, if you don't hear that click, then you won't be in position to draw the hammer a second time. Nothing's going to happen. So that click tells you you've made it down. And then again, primary, transferring, secondary, caught just under the edge of the hammer, and kaboom! And then the spring back here does its whole trigger return thing. So that's what's going on inside of the revolver. Oh, well, let's see. When I go to take this out, another noticeable thing, the hammer, you can take it in and out from this position when it's all the way forward if there's no other parts in the gun, or you can take it out when it's back here, but in the middle of its stroke, notice it's inside the frame. And so you would not actually be able to lift it out here. You're going to lift it a few millimeters and then it's going to stop. So don't try and tug it out. That's why I first released it by pulling the trigger all the way back to get it into this rear position, and then it cleared everything. Dropping it back in, depending on what order you're putting it in, you can put it in from the top or the bottom. So just some tidbits about that. So the last disassembly thing, just so we can say we did it all, is this tiny spring inside the hammer. And it's I'm spacing on what they call this part. That's so embarrassing. It's a really interesting mechanism in this case because it's not held in by a pin. It's just the geometry of this part and the fact that there's a spring in there is what holds the whole thing together. So you can only put them together by pushing the small one into the large one. But in terms of taking it apart and all that, you're just sliding it off the top of the hammer. And I put the knife in there so that I wouldn't bend the spring too much as I was doing that. So there is a little bit of a cup in the hammer. So that spring, you do want to help it past that first coil getting out of that little slot. It's in a substantial hole on the leg. I'm going to call it the leg because I can't remember what it's supposed to be called. Forgive me. So it's in a big hole there. So really you have two ways to get rid of the spring. You can either come in here and compress the crap out of it, or you can come in here at the bottom and just lift it up a little bit to get past that first coil. So once the spring is aside, you can see that there's nothing else. There's nothing holding these together but their geometry. Once you have to lay the one into the other, and it can't come any further forward than those internal pieces let it. And again, the thing that I was showing you before that I should not have, I was saying that this was the sear surface. This is a sear surface that's not actually used in this firearm because it has no single action mode. If we, let's see, what's the best way to demonstrate that? Give me a second to think about that. If this had a single action mode, that other surface would be involved. That would be where everything sat when you cocked it. So if you just cocked the thumb cocking lever, then it would be resting on this sear and the same back edge of the gun. So it's much harder to do this out of the gun. So anyway, it would be looking something like this from engagement. If it were in that single action mode, the trigger would be back and this would be holding it steady until you pulled the trigger and it fell off. In this one, since it's double action only, it's actually the underside of the whole hammer, this surface here, that is your sear. And so that's where it drops off. So let me see if there's actually any way to show what the single action cocked position would look like. And I don't think there is on this one. I think that geometry-wise, it's just not there. Oh, I'm wrong. Look at that. So, or let me see, I had the... It does catch, but I don't think it's actually... No, it's not a real catch. They've changed the geometry of the trigger, so that this trigger is not really designed to catch that. I don't know if this hammer is the exact same hammer on the ones that have the exposed hammer, and they just cut off that piece, but they did in fact make the trigger different enough that it's not going to actually properly catch in that sear. They engage a little bit, but not enough, I don't think, for it to work. Well, maybe. It's hard to say. Wow. All right. So if the hammer... So if it were a single action, then all of the force for cocking would come from the hammer, and the trigger would be being pushed forward by the trigger return spring. So when you got to that point of it being cocked... Oh, that's what it is. I am doing it on the wrong sear. I think that's it. It's the other one. Ha ha. Yes. So this would actually work as a single action. It's actually the top sear that grabs it, and then pulling the trigger would let it drop. It's easier to see if you actually have a single double action revolver and you can look at these things. But yeah, revolver design is pretty cool. You have a lot of different places in that back of the trigger that can do different things for you. So, anywho, neither here nor there. Sorry about that. Distractions. What else? Let's throw the guts back together, and then we'll take down the cylinder as a separate project. And while we're here, I will show you a little bit about how to apply some grease. This is my favorite generic grease. It's what the Army uses for, or used back in the day. Your M1s, your Grands, your old school military rifles. This was the stuff, and I'm pretty sure this will last me several lifetimes. And I'm just gonna scoop up a little bit of it and smear it around. Now this is not a good way to do this because cotton has fibers, and so this is going to leave fibers behind. So first off, that was also a boatload of grease. So we're going to come in here and kind of undo most of that. And I'm going to focus on the surfaces that I care about. So I know that this surface is an important one. And I'm not talking about the back, I'm talking about the bottom. And then the pins. And there's a little well, so to speak, around the pins. And that's designed to be somewhat of not a bearing, more of a bushing, I guess. But basically, two things can happen there. One is it can have a small repository of grease, which is handy, but also any goop that gets in there has somewhere to make its way to where it's not going to interfere with the operation of the actual firearm. And of course, all around the trigger, we're doing the same thing. And the right way to do this is with an acid brush. And acid brushes are disposable. They're like, 50 cents each. You buy them in packs of like 50. And they, don't last real long because they're not designed to. They're just essentially one-time use brushes. And the idea of this particular grease, as you can see from their logo, it's the film. So if you leave grease and you can see it, you're not using grease correctly. This is not car grease. We're not packing bearings and things where we want a large quantity of grease. This grease is useful when it's a nearly invisible film. So as I spread this around, wherever you can see black, that's really the right amount of grease. Wherever you can see the white, that's way too damn much. And so right now I'm just kind of swooping it everywhere. The brush would make this easier, but I don't have it. So there you go. Put it all in there because that's where the crane goes. And so one of the things that I tend to do is put too much on and then take most of it off. And that works for me. You do you, I do me. I also like to actually, this upper rim is just where the plate is going to sit, and to have a little bit in there means that the plate is more likely to be more willing to come off next time. I had to whack it for a while because that oil kind of forms a bit of a seal, but this way it'll all just pop right off next time. Don't get it inside the screw holes, by the way. Don't want it to unscrew itself. Alright, and so what I would do now is keep removing it because there's still too much on there. The only place that I really want to see it, and even there I barely want to see it, is in those grooves at the base of the pins. And so really I want to remove a lot of what's out there. Because the goal is what I'm leaving behind in the form of a film. That's what grease does best. When it has that little filmy layer, that's exactly what it needs to lubricate stuff, and not so much goop that it's going to accumulate fouling and gunk. But every part in there is going to be smooth as butter. Like butter, baby. That looks pretty decent. Again, if I had the acid brush like I was supposed to, that would work a lot better because it's easier to get that film on everything. This is not, this grease is essentially safe to handle. It doesn't have the molybdenum in it or anything super high tech. It's not a temperature grease. It's just a grease. Actually, I'm going to take this guy back out to maximize my effectiveness of my grease on him. Oh, shot through the arm and almost lost a spring. So, like I said, the key thing with grease is put it on until you can't see it anymore. If you can still see it, keep wiping. You should just have the film, not the white colored opaque looking grease. And all of the things that rub against other things are the parts that are really important. The reason I put it everywhere is just protection. So the layer of film will keep it from rusting the same way oil keeps it from rusting, because grease is an oil suspension as a general rule. But where the parts are actually going to touch each other, that's where we do it for lubrication. So we're doing this for two different purposes at once as we go. That's why I put a little bit more on parts that are actually moving parts. And with the rest of it, spread it around with my fingers is fine. Mostly I'm trying to get some of that cotton off of there. And same thing with this guy. This guy is polished for absolutely no reason. The one area that should be polished, the sear surface, rough as hell. No idea what I was thinking when I did that. That's probably also supposed to be even or a little bit rounded. I don't know what I was thinking. And Mr. Tiny Spring. And the reason that the cotton sucks is the whole point of grease in there is to keep water off of the parts. I mean, yes, lubrication, but the other is protection. And if there's cotton in there, that's going to suck up water. Beautiful. Continuing my reign of greasy terror. If you want to fast forward, that's fine. Obviously, watching me grease parts is not ultimately exciting. I will not be offended. If you're wondering, though, how to get in all of these little nooks and crannies, then feel free to watch me address everything. And remember that when I'm putting it on the parts that aren't moving parts, it's there to protect it from water. And when I'm putting it on the moving parts, well, that's because they're moving parts. And again, it's the film, not layers of grease, that we're looking for here. So again, going over it with my fingers afterwards just to try and remove some of the cotton from the fuzzy Q-tip. I also have a fuzzy mat, which isn't helping. So that's the other thing. Grease is easier to use in many ways than oil, but you'll never see me use it on semi-automatic or automatic guns, with the exception of the M1s and older guns that actually were designed for it. Almost all modern firearms are designed for very lightweight oils, not even gun oil, but CLP to be their actual lubricant. Heavy gun oils just make them accumulate fouling. They tend to run dirtier anyway, and so you just don't use grease, and unless you have a really good reason to. In other words, you have to justify not using oil. You should never consider grease first on any modern firearm. And revolvers are the exception because they are nearly closed systems. There's only little spaces that goop can get in. This hole is always plugged. The firing pin one, not so much. So stuff can get in there, but you really can't get past the firing pin. And then there's the window that the hand comes through, and then the window that the bolt comes through. So that's the only ways in. The grips cover everything down here, and the trigger pretty much fills the trigger hole. Maybe you could argue there's a little space in there that something could get in. But as a general rule, these things stay clean on the inside. You generally only have to clean the outer bits. This is another piece that's critical. The hand will wear, the bolt will wear over time. Bolt it's also called the cylinder stop, depending on who's manufacturer of the firearm. You want the bolt to fill the window. If the bolt can move left and right, that's bad juju. So these are generally made oversized and then filed off a half a thousandth at a time kind of thing until they just barely fit. And that's how they're put together, because you want that to basically latch in here perfectly and not have any wiggle room. So if this has gotten nicked and you have to file it down, you're going to have all kinds of problems because the cylinder doesn't lock up perfectly. Suddenly you're starting to fire shots that aren't perfectly aligned with the bore, and hopefully it's obvious that that's a bad thing, because if it goes too far, the forcing cone can't compensate for it and the gun blows up. I have a Chiappa Rhino that happened to. We'll I'll have to take that one down one day. I do not like that particular firearm though. So getting this guy back in, again, we're going to line him up on his pin and then the trigger pin. And before he goes down too far, we're going to come in with the hobby knife and compress the coil. Whoops. Nearly launching it across the room in the process. And then completely failing. For my next trick, let's try that again. Same as before, we're just going to pay attention this time. Before we let it get down too far, we are going to come in here, compress the coils at the same time, and then make sure that we don't push it too far down without lining that coil up a little bit. And that coil, by the way, will work itself into place, pretty quickly within a few times, because it does move forwards and backwards as well as up and down while it's doing its thing. What do we want to put in next? I guess we'll put in our cylinder stop. Now, because I put a whole bunch of grease on it, I want to take some of that grease off the threads at least. Or it will unwind itself. And again, we're going to line it up as best we can, but don't try and push it in there yet. We're going to compress the pin before we try and get it to go down in there. So work our way down. And, let's see. There we go. No force in that application. It was just gently wiggling it till it gets in. You really don't want to deform the head of that. And once that's in, we can put the screw back on. I like to actually completely miss when I do that. Make sure you don't do that. I actually popped it up a little bit and got it out of its channel, so hang on to it. And you'll also want to draw it back just a little bit to make sure that you're not caught on the lip. Screwdriver. Just making sure I wasn't cross-threaded. And tighten him down. Beauty. So, what do we got? Oh, our firing pin. That'll work. I still have greasy fingers here. Literally grease on my fingers because I was applying grease. And that's really kind of what I'm doing on a lot of the rest of these pieces. I don't need to go back to the well for more grease because I'm covered in it. So we use what's already on our grubby digits. And when we want to put that firing pin in, we can guide a little spring in first. That's fine. Well, not on that end. Come on. This is easier or harder depending on how nimble your fingers are and how fat they are. My big fat fingers tends to be somewhat awkward. There we go. Now once it starts going in, I don't want to shove it all the way in without making sure that the cutout is on the bottom side where it's going to line up with this little pin when I put it in. If this pin has a flat side and a rounded side, then stick the flat side in first. The rounded side will go into the frame cover more easily. Push the firing pin in just a little bit, and if you didn't rotate too far, that pin will drop right in there. And it does protrude. It doesn't go down flush because it is an anchor point for, or in this one it's not. I'm sorry, I lied. Some guns there's actually a cutout for that pin. In this particular one, there's actually just a big missing piece there. The other thing you might notice about the side panel here is that it has this underhang. That's the other reason you don't want to pry it up, is because it's actually tucked under the top there. And that's why prying can mess up all these angles. And that's why it's all shiny there, because I didn't know what I was doing back in the day. So, I think I want to do my trigger next. So, getting the hand in place. Now, if we just stick this in there, that ain't right, because the little spring leg is on the wrong side of the hand. And so what we need to do is to get it partially started. So notice that the larger part of this hole is where the actual pin goes, and the small part is where the half pin goes that interacts with the handspring. So what I'm going to do is just put it in there partially and try and get it pulled out to the point where I might be able to manipulate that spring and get it onto the far side. Whoops. Far side of the other leg. So come in here. Oops. Alright. And of course I've managed to pop the whole thing out. So we're going to grab our spring again with our super shitty pliers. Wow, these are bad. And try and get him to place. I realize that you probably can't see jack, but there's not much I can do about that in this case, because we're putting a dark thing inside of a small thing. I can tell you about the orientation of which way is up, because that's relevant. We want this orientation because when it's operating, the long leg is essentially under this one, and we want it to be pushing. No. Wow. I said it wrong. I'm so sorry, guys. We want it to be pushing down on the top of that leg to be pulling it forward, and so we want the coil to get tighter as this leg gets bent more. If you put the coil in the other way, then it's actually pulling against the coil. So orientation wise, we want it to be, or we always want to be flexing in the direction, wow, I keep spinning it around, in the direction that the spring should get more tightly coiled when it's under tension, not less tightly coiled. That's what I'm trying to say. Just doing it extremely poorly. There we go. So now Mr. Spring is tucked back in there again, and we're going to try and get this lined up one more time. So we push the leg all the way past where it's going to normally go, and then push the hand in the rest of the way so that the short leg is now on the far side of the sear. So if you did all that right, then you should see a couple different things. One is if you get your flashlight and look inside the little cutout, as well as a giant blob of nasty grease, you should see the other leg of the spring all the way tucked in there, and everything else should just be kind of in place. It's not going to go anywhere, and from a tension wise, it's pulling the hand forward as much as it can throughout its whole range of motion. And even at its farthest point, it's designed to not actually drop off the spring. You never actually have that much tension on it. It only goes to there. So anyway, now our trigger is there, so we can put our trigger in. Making a video. Sorry guys. So I'm going to pull the hand back because we can't just put the trigger on or the hand will bump into everything. So pull the hand back and line it up with trigger hole, trigger pin, and gently, ever so gently. Alright, something is in my way. I have an obstruction. There we go. I was bumping into the underside of the hand, so make sure you actually get that nose of the trigger into that compartment, and obviously you can move that around. So once it's all the way in, the hand will now be able to go forward, pop over all that good stuff. Now there's one piece of the trigger that's not actually in there at the moment, which is this guy, and so I'm going to just drop him in and make sure that he goes in the right orientation. Little barbell guy. There we go. And once he's in there, he'll pretty much stay where we want him to. And then we can worry about getting this guy in there. So there's my grease depositor. Now this one is a good one to make sure you get release. Again, it has a gap in the bottom, and that's so that any fouling does get pushed into that and has somewhere to go rather than actually bind up the mechanism. And all the rest of this is a few places where it does touch other bits of metal, so we'll just go ahead and lube the whole thing. But we do want to get just a little extra bit in the hole where blarp, where the trigger strut meets it, so that has, you know, smooth motion all the way around. Go ahead and clean the inside of that out, even though it's just a spring that it touches, not a big deal. And so now when we put this in there, we do want to make sure that we catch the trigger correctly. So you want to make sure you catch like that. You're aiming so that the ball of the back of the trigger there goes into the little hole, which means the nose piece here is above it, and the little ball and socket joint actually engages, and that's what we want. And then I'm going to move that trigger to a forward position, and here's where having that correct tool can make all the difference in life, but I don't have it, so we're going to do it without it. which means we have to come in here and compress these coils far enough that we can get past the post and slide that guy down. So now we have trigger return force. And you should be able to feel at each point when something different is happening with the trigger. So yeah, what I feel is one level of tension to right about here, and then it changes because the hand is going to get fluxed further back as it goes. So that's because the hand first comes forward enough that we can see it poke out the window, but then it goes back in after it's lifted the cylinder. And that ledge that makes it go in means this spring is being flexed more, so we feel a slight increase in that tension at that point, and then through this. But through the rest of it, should be pretty damn smooth. And it is. All right. So I think we decided that if we pulled the trigger all the way, that we could get the hammer in the easiest. Oh, that's another thing that you can't see me doing, and I'm just doing out of habit. When I go to pull the trigger, I'm moving the cylinder lock back so that I don't run into it. If the cylinder lock is forward, it's going to bump into the hand and stop it from doing anything correctly. And what we want is it to go forward and straight up. So that's what was happening, is the cylinder is getting pulled back because I wasn't pulling the safety in. Now we can see the cylinder go all the way up. That's what I should have been showing you. Sorry. And you know what? I'm not happy with my cylinder. That seems to be... I think I may have cross-threaded this guy. I didn't feel good about him when I was screwing him in. So I'm going to take this out and make sure that I did not hose this up. I mean, it's not the most solidly engaging thing ever designed, but normally I try and pull it back a little bit because in a perfect world this will align and actually seat in there, and I think that was where my mistake was. I did not have it seated. So the reason that opening is wide is so that it matches up on this, and on this there's even a plus and a minus which actually matches the hole. So this is actually the plus side, and then at the edge here is where the other side lines up. And that whole oval shape here should go into the frame so that this piece isn't just pushing on that screw, it's also riding in the oval cutout channel. So I had it a little bit cattywampus, and I think that was why it was freaking me out. So now that I got it on there straight, let's put that back in. And oh yeah, I was definitely messed up before. So now that it's all the way in there, tightened up, and yeah, it moves a lot less. That's good news. Okay, back to our hammer. So I'm going to pull that, I'm going to pull the trigger, and I'm going to try and get the hammer in essentially a mostly rear position. And there we go. If I were an amazing... so there's really no other way to get it in there. I don't think it can come out in this position. Once the hammer lock is there, it's already caught under the front of the frame. So yeah, you really do need to have it all the way in that back position so that you can get it to clear. And see how it just barely clears the hand, that rounded area in the back of the hand? That's just clearance for removing the hammer and putting it back in. And then also, if you get it in and you're not sure if it's on the right side of the hand, the wrong side of the hand, while the trigger's all the way back, remember that's the fire position. So you should be able to let the hammer come forward, hit the firing pin and all that good stuff, and then let the trigger come down through its reset stroke. So last piece here is hammer strut, and just gonna lube that bad boy up a bit, wipe most of it off, and it slides kind of up and under. I mean, you can see that it's in its little cutout, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. And then as we pull the trigger, again remembering to pull back the latch on the far side over here, we'll be able to engage the trigger and make sure that the rounded cup is seating in the frame where it's supposed to. And once you push it just a little bit past that point, now you've got the whole thing built. I would not fire it like I just did a whole lot while the frame is off. It's just gonna break stuff. When it comes to the rest of the frame, same concept. We're going to put grease in the parts that are the most moving around parts. So trigger and hammer. And sometimes I have to actually sit there and do this in my head a couple times to figure out what other parts are moving. This is another pin, but it doesn't actually rotate around that pin. So that's not, so in this case, you see the polished area where there's a moving part. And so those pins are not only rotating, but the part underneath them does. And so then I'm just gonna spread that around until I have that film that we want with grease over the whole thing, just to protect it. Same with in here, there's no moving bits that touch this, but if we put our layer of lube in there, it will protect against elements. And then I'm going to go around the outside just to make it so it pops in and out a little bit easier. This part doesn't matter, that's actually the base, but all these other parts are where it well, that doesn't matter either, where it actually slides into the side of the frame. And then take off the extra grease so that I don't have quite so much. And again, we just want that film. Not a whole lot of goop. Try to get all the furry bits off. And remember that we're going to tuck this little corner, the extension tall piece, line that up with its hole first. And then you want to get this whole thing going into place at the same time. You don't want to get the front in first or the back in first. You want them to be going in at the same time. And the same amount everywhere. And it should smoothly close. Just like that. And if you actually did that, yours should not have this giant mark in it, which I got from prying off the previous ones. So wipe off the grease that I just got all over the outside of it. I need grease on the trigger, and we can go pop in 2 of our 3 frame screws so that we don't forget and bump them off later. So these are oily. Bear with me, I try and clean up my screws a little bit. And this is another important one. Don't use a screwdriver that's wider than the head of your screw, because this is a recessed screw. The minute it goes past flush, it will tear up the whole side of the gun. So Again, just getting the oil off of these screws so they hold better. And again, make sure this part is flush before you screw these, and you don't want to be flexing this side plate while you do these things. So once they're in there, you can snug them up a little bit. You don't got to go overboard. It's an aluminum gun and aluminum frame and steel screws, so you go overboard and, well, no more gun. Okay, so part one, we're good. Now let's talk about the cylinders. Cylinders, not particularly crazy complicated, but kind of neat. And the crane itself, of course. Obviously, you want to clean these quite well. The cylinder has to slide on this one, so it should not have any edges or buildup or anything like that. And then, of course, the gun swings in and out on this one. Not as important, but it should still be kept clean. And the back of it you want clean as well, because you don't want buildup there that could eventually bump into the cylinder. Now, if you have snap caps, this is a very good use for them, is to brace the cylinder while you unscrew the ejector. We want to get this ejector going, and in order to do that, you have to turn it. And basically, depending on who made the revolver and when they made it, sometimes they are left-hand threaded, sometimes they are right-hand threaded. But regardless, when you go to unscrew it, if you can see, as I wiggle it left and right, you see the extractor moving a bit. If you have rounds in there, they will support the ejector. So not real rounds, dummy rounds. So if you put some snap caps in here before you unscrew it, and you will actually extend the life of your ejector significantly. And my big problem right now is I don't remember if this one's left or right hand threaded, and it's on so tight that I'm probably going to have to use the vise to get it started again. Padding in the vise, of course. Oh, I got it. All right. So this one is, in fact, left-hand threaded, which means instead of righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, this one is righty-unscrewy. So righty-loosey for this guy. And if you don't know, the trick is to make sure you don't ever put this in a vise, but a padded vise, meaning wood or rubber, to hold on to it. And turn it one way. If it doesn't budge at all, turn it a little bit the other way, and you keep increasing your force gently until you figure out which way it breaks, and then you unscrew it that way. Or, Google. And just ask the Google, which way is the right way? And Google will make all things clear. So this is a hollow tube with threads on the inside. Then you have a small spring on the end of the actual ejector rod. You have a large spring going into the cylinder. You have the ejector itself, and in this case, why is that being... Oh, that's just tight on the end. So ejector rod, spring. This is the actual... So the springs do two different things. This spring is the force that pushes this into place and holds the center. So that's the one that makes the little line across your pretty frame. So that's the responsibility of this spring, is to dig in there and then pop this into the inside. And then this is the actual ejector spring. So once the end is on here, that's going to push that spring, and that's the spring that's going to ride the whole thing forward and then pop it back out so the ejector stays in the gun. So just remember the order that these guys go on. It's not real hard to figure it out. and clean, 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 clean. This piece does tend to get goopy, and there's a lot of places where you don't want it to be goopy. So the underside of it, absolutely clean. The edges of it, you don't want buildup there, or that will affect your ability to get rounds in and out. Pretty much every one of these funky surfaces around the sides, all you want to clean to within an inch of their life. And then the pads themselves. My pads are pretty worn down, which is bad. I should get a new ejector. But one thing that's nice is they tend to make these so they can't go in wrong. Which means if you're sitting here and looking carefully, these are all at slightly different angles. So this is a flat on the top, but this one's at an angle. This one's at a steeper angle, and back around. So there's only one way that this would actually fit in and actually made up with all those holes. And so it's not rotational is the key. This has got a flat surface, and the hole that it goes into has got a flat on one side. So you can't put it in wrong. And that also is why it's stable enough, with or without supporting rounds, to be able to unscrew the rest of it. So that's rarely just going to be a hole that you drop it into and then it freely spins. Now, not all of them go out of the way to make each of these a different size. So that you can't count on. Sometimes they are uniform. Not really sure what the benefit of making them non-uniform is, but I'm sure someone at Smith & Wesson knows. And again, just cleaning this out, we're going to apply some grease in there this time. And now that you've got it all apart, clean, 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 clean. You don't want any buildup inside here. Anything that's going to change the dimensions, the way this thing seats together, you want to make sure that all that kind of buildup is not present. If fouling does build up there, then these things aren't going to be fitting back together as well as they should, and they will cause you functional problems over time. Yeah, this one, I haven't cleaned this one properly in a long time. This one will probably work better once I get done with it. Alright, so just a little grease to get going. And again, I'm going to spread that all the way around. Not in the cylinders, idiot. Sorry about that. Just lubed one of my cylinders. That's not a smart or clever thing to do. Wipe that off before we grease up our rounds. Greased my guns. No, not like that. Other surfaces that we want to have lubrication on: the actual shaft itself for easy, smooth ejection. And again, not so much that you can see it, just enough to leave that film on it. These ones merely for protection, not actual lubrication, so to speak. If you have a pipe cleaner, you can kind of use that to lubricate the path of the ejector rod itself all the way through the middle there, and as well as to scrub any goop off of the sides of this. Scrub my little pads, spread that oil around, knock the fuzzies off. There we go. Still more fuzzies than I like. So we can start putting it back together. Extractor. Extract rod. Small spring. Large spring. And remember that it's reverse threaded, so turning it left to tighten it. And again, better if you have rounds in there to support it. And tighten it up. And the last thing we have to deal with from a lubrication and functioning point of view is the crane. Inside of the crane is a place that gets fouled. It's not ultra important, but it should be, fairly well clean. Outside, much more important, because this is what the actual cylinder is rolling around on. And if there's anything binding it up, then it's gonna make your trigger pull inconsistent. It's gonna make it feel funny and weird, and cause you all manner of little problems. Now, obviously, there's way too much grease on that, but like I said, I tend to put too much on and then take a bunch of it off as I grease other parts of it. I'm gonna go ahead and grease the passageway there. Even though it doesn't make strong contact, it'll keep it from getting rusted. Keeping this end shiny is a good idea too. And of course, where it rotates in the gun itself as you open and close it, doesn't hurt to have just a dab of lube on that surface. And then I'm going to come in here and wipe off all my excess. And then come in with my fingers and get off all the furry bits. So you can test that by slipping it on, and it should spin very freely. And if it does, and you're happy with it, you can go to put it back in the gun. And the way we want to do that is we set it there because you have to be getting it on both of these at the same time, and give it some room to maneuver as you line those guys up. I think I might have just done that off frame, so I'm going to try and do that again. Basically, your crane is going to go into the cylinder at the same time that it goes into the gun. And so you kind of just hold the cylinder near the open position until it lines up, and then you go ahead and close it. Once it's closed, then you can put its original screw back in. And remember, this is a screw that's also a detent. I think it's the one for which I used this screwdriver. And opens, spins, closes, and we should be able to take it through its paces. Last but not least is the grips. Now remember that there's going to be a little hole as well as the screw holding it together, so make sure that you get that little hole lined up. And the screw goes in this way. And then we need an even bigger screwdriver to match that one. This is one thing I don't like about it, is this one didn't have any kind of covering on the other end. The screw just sticks out the far side. If you over screw it, it sticks way out. So find a happy medium where, it's not going to interfere with your grip, but that it's not going to come loose either. And that is the Smith & Wesson Airweight 38 special. I didn't like the sights, so I put some glow-in-the-dark paint on them. Didn't really help, but that's another shortcoming of it. It is melted pretty well for pocket carry, or at least pocket holsters. That's one of the other design elements. This is commonly a purse gun as well, and that it's really designed to not have a whole lot of stuff that it can snag on. And so no sharp corners, no edges, no sights with big square, pieces. This should pretty much be able to pull out. If it had a hammer, obviously it can snag on belt loops and everything else, your keys and all the other crap in your purse, or your merce if you're a man, whatever you're carrying, we know. It's not the worst trigger pull in the world. So that's the other thing when you do revolvers, that they should have solid lockup. So I'm pulling my trigger, and there I heard the hand click into place, and I still have a good bit of trigger pull left. That tells me that it's going to lock up securely every time. I can put a little bit of resistance against it. Don't squeeze it, but just, hold a finger against it and make sure that it still does that, locking each time, and that all of your chambers lock. And that they lock. You hear the click of the lock. Whoops. Let's try that again. You should hear the click of the lock before the hammer drops. I'm just not listening carefully enough. There. Popped into place. So here it goes. Tink. And then bang. Tink, bang. Forcing cone, by the way, that's the area at the back of the barrel. It's wider than the barrel, and it just has a little bit of a taper. So if a cylinder isn't perfectly aligned, it's not going to just blow up as soon as you pull the trigger. The cylinder gap is a issue. There's what they call end shake, is how much the cylinder moves forward or backward. In a perfect world, it would basically barely move at all. And the gap, which there's no way you're going to see on film, but how much space there is between the end of the cylinder and the beginning of the barrel is important, because gas comes out of that. Now, with a 38 special, it's not going to hurt you if your grip is bad. If you have a forward grip, you're going to feel it, but you're not going to lose a thumb. If you have a Smith & Wesson 500, then you're going to lose a thumb if you do that. So revolvers are designed to be held essentially like that. You don't hold a revolver up forward like you do with a semi-automatic, because the gases will escape that gap and burn you on low caliber ones, but on a high caliber one, that gap is enough that it'll take your finger right off with it. It's pretty awful. So again, your grip is that, and then just a support. It's not that forward control support like you do with semi-automatics. You keep your hands at the back of a revolver. And they kick like a mule anyway, so you kind of got to. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you had fun. Stay safe out there.